It's hot in here. All right, thank you all for coming, and let me thank Senator Ed Markey, who is on the Health Committee and chair of the Health Subcommittee, for being with us as well. There is a lot of discussion in our country as to how divided we are as a people, and there's obviously a lot of truth in that. On many, many issues, there is a deep division in our country. But I got to tell you that on one of the most important matters facing our country, the American people, whether they're Democrats, Republicans, independents, conservatives, progressives, whatever, they could not be more united. And that is the need to take on the extraordinary greed of the pharmaceutical industry and to substantially lower the outrageously high cost of prescription drugs in America. On that, the American people are united. As a nation, we spend almost twice as much as any other nation on health care. Almost twice as much. We're now spending over $13,000 for every man, woman, and child. That is an astronomical and unsustainable amount of money. And one of the reasons that we spend so much is the high cost of prescription drugs. So when we talk about the high cost of prescription drugs, it is not just that 1 out of 4 Americans cannot afford the prescription drugs their doctors prescribe. And think about how crazy that is. Sick, go to the doctor, writes out a prescription, you can't afford it. That's crazy. But on top of that, you have hospitals spending a fortune on prescription drugs. Just spoke to a CEO of a hospital. 20% of his budget goes to prescription drugs. You are talking about insurance premiums going up because of the high cost of prescription drugs, not to mention the fact that taxpayers are spending a fortune on the cost of Medicare and Medicaid because of the high cost of prescription drugs. Meanwhile, not often talked about, but as prescription drugs in our country are unaffordable for millions of Americans, 10 of the top pharmaceutical companies in our country made over $110 billion in profits in 2022. $110 billion in profits while people cannot afford the medicine their doctors prescribe. And these companies almost always pay outrageously high compensation packages to their CEOs. As chairman of the Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, one of my top priorities is to lower the outrageously high cost of prescription drugs in this country. Now, one of the ways that we do that is to hold the chief executives and CEOs of some of the largest pharmaceutical companies in our country accountable for what they are doing. Over 2 months ago, a majority of senators on the Health, Education, Labor, and Pension Committee invited Robert Davis, the CEO of Merck, Joaquin Duato, the CEO of Johnson & Johnson, and Chris Berner, the CEO of Bristol-Myers Squibb, to a hearing to discuss what they are doing to lower prescription drug prices in America. Now, why did we ask these CEOs to come before us? The answer is pretty simple, and it is right behind me. Among other questions, we would like some simple answers as to why does the United States pay, by far, the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs, sometimes 10 times higher for the same exact drug sold in Canada or in Europe, Mexico, as in the United States? Why is it that the median price of new prescription drugs in America is now over $220,000, including many new cancer drugs, $220,000? Why has the pharmaceutical industry spent over the past 25 years some $8.5 billion on lobbying and over $700 million on campaign contributions? Why are they spending tens of millions of dollars today on some 1,800 well-paid lobbyists all over Capitol Hill? 1,800. You got 100 senators, 435 members of the House, 1,800 lobbyists from the pharmaceutical industry, including former leaders of the Republican and Democratic parties. How does it happen that while millions of Americans cannot afford the prescription drugs they need, major drug companies in our country spend more on stock buybacks and dividends than they do on research and development? These are pretty simple and straightforward questions. These are the questions that are on the minds of many elderly people in our country, working people who go to the drugstore, can't afford the prescription drugs that they desperately need. Now, as a result of our invitation, Chris Berner, the CEO of Bristol Myers Squibb, has agreed to voluntarily testify before the Health Committee, and we very much appreciate that. Unfortunately, up to this point, the CEOs of Johnson & Johnson and Merck have rejected our invitation. They apparently feel that they do not have to explain to the American people why prescription drug prices in this country are so outrageously high. As a result, that puts the Health Committee, the Health Education Labor Committee, in the position of having to subpoena these CEOs in order to have them testify. That vote will take place this Wednesday, January 31st at 11 a.m. The CEO of Merck needs to explain to the American people why they charge diabetes patients in the United States $6,900 for Januvia, when the exact same product can be purchased in Canada for $900 and just $200 in France. Pretty simple question, isn't it? How come you're charging those guys a fraction of what you're charging us? We want the CEO of Johnson & Johnson to explain to the American people why they charge Americans with arthritis $79,000 for Stelara, when it can be purchased for just $16,000 in the United Kingdom. We want the CEO of Bristol Myers Squibb to tell us why they're charging patients here $7,100 for Eliquis, when the same product can be purchased for just $900 in Canada and $650 in France. I think it's an interesting question. You know, I think millions of Americans would love to know why we are charged 10 times more than other countries for the same exact product. And let me be very clear. These companies that we want to bring before us, they're not struggling companies desperately needing to raise prices to survive. 2022, Johnson & Johnson made nearly $18 billion in profits, paid its CEO over $27 million in compensation, spent over $17 billion in stock buybacks and dividends. That same year, Merck made $14 billion in profits, handed over $7 billion in dividends, paid their CEO $52 million. And Bristol Myers Squibb paid $6.3 billion in profits, while recently spending over $12 billion on stock buybacks, and provided their CEO with $41 million in compensation. Now, the reasons the companies have given us as to why they don't believe their CEO should testify range from the laughable to the absurd. They really are pretty funny. They have told us that the CEOs of Johnson & Johnson and Merck just don't have the expertise necessary to tell us why they charge so much more for their medicine here than abroad. CEOs of the company don't have their expertise, really. Merck went so far, and this is really interesting, to tell our staff that their CEO is a tax attorney who is not an expert on prescription drug prices. And they said that, I think, with a straight face. Well, maybe, just maybe, the CEOs of these pharmaceutical companies should become experts on why they're ripping off the American people. And if they did, maybe they would give some thought about lowering the outrageous prices that they are charging us. The companies also claim that the Health Committee is somehow retaliating against Merck and Johnson & Johnson for filing lawsuits against the administration's plan to negotiate for low drug prices on Medicare. This is absurd. These companies have every right to file a lawsuit against the administration or anyone else. Let me just conclude by saying this. It is no great secret that many Americans are giving up on democracy. They're giving up on their government. They look at Washington and they're saying, hey, what are these people doing? Do they know that I can't afford prescription drugs? Do they know the pain that I'm experiencing? Or are they too busy getting campaign contributions and listening to lobbyists? That's the sad truth. Well, I got to say this. So long as I am chairman of the Health Committee, we're going to be listening to the needs of ordinary Americans, and we are going to be prepared to hold large corporations, no matter how many campaign contributions they make, no matter how many lobbyists they have, we are going to hold them accountable. Ed Markey is the chairman of the subcommittee on this health care.
Thank you.